Today, I am interviewing David Jones. He is the board chair of Humana Foundation, also the founder of Chrysalis Ventures. He was also board chair for Humana Inc. Yes, that Humana Inc. And he's got a wealth of experience he's going to share with us today. Please enjoy this interview. David, if you would, please tell the audience a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you became the chair of the Humana Foundation.
Okay, Michael, thank you very much first for having me on. It's great to talk to you, and I hope this will be a fun conversation for both us and your listeners and viewers. So my background is, I'll try to zip through it. I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky. My father was one of two founders of Humana back when I was 3 years old. It was initially one nursing home and it grew and grew and grew over time, but it really wasn't much of a company until I was 13, 14. You know, I was in my teenage years when the company is, when whatever your parents are doing is not maybe the first uppermost thing on your mind. You're more into peers and sports and all that kind of stuff. Um, I left for college at 18. I went to Yale. After college, I went to teach English in China for 2 years at a medical school. And there's a whole, had very strong interest in both foreign language learning and teaching, coming heavily from my mom's side. Her mom was a Latin teacher, a whole interesting story there. And I really had the East Asia bug. The 1980s were when China was just beginning to reopen to the rest of the world, and economic development was roaring away in other parts of Asia already. So I spent most of the 80s in that frame. I went to law school along the way, went back to Yale, went to Yale Law School, and then to the State Department as an international lawyer representing the US government, and was getting ready to move to Singapore with our two young children, each born in DC, when my dad's co-founder at Humana died unexpectedly. And for a range of reasons, um, my wife and I decided, she's not from Louisville, but we decided to, go back to Louisville for me, not back for her, as she frequently says. And we thought we'd give it 3 to 5 years, be great for the children to be with their extended family. And, I was interested in trying to be useful. I'm the oldest of five and have a little bit of that complex or whatever that oldest child syndrome is, probably. But long story short, healthcare business was fascinating. The family, extended family, my wife and I both thought was really good for our family, for the kids. And ultimately, her parents moved here from New Jersey when her dad retired, and too long a family story. But I did two things in Louisville in those early years. The first was learn about Humana, the company, and join the board. Now, I was in no sense a healthcare expert, nor was I ever employed by the company, but I viewed myself as a shareholder representative first and foremost. So I had a governance role. Our family was at that point the largest non-institutional shareholder in the company, and so we're going to talk a little bit more. And I know this podcast is very focused on governance, but that was a very conscious thought in my mind. And recall, I was a State Department lawyer before that. A big part of the role of a federal lawyer was ensuring really that the kind of the, it's not really a contract, but the legislative deal between the operators of the federal government, the executive branch folks, and the representatives of the people in the Congress are abided by, and that the work is done according to the rules in the public interest, all that kind of, all that lawyerly, nerdy governance stuff was very much ingrained in me, when I came back to work with Humana. So that was it. The other thing I did was, because I didn't want to work for my dad, I didn't want to work for the company. I had an old friend who had sold his business recently, made some money, and the two of us got together and started a venture capital firm. We thought that was a pretty cool business model, because you proclaim yourself to be a venture capitalist and then people come to you with they're interesting ideas. They're always interesting. They're not always feasible. But we learned that business together and, it survived for 34 years or whatever, which in a highly cyclical space like venture capital has been a good thing. So I've worked with 80 something younger companies along the way, been on a great many other boards with different characteristics. Um, so my professional life has been largely focused in those two areas. Humana, which is now a integrated payer, and then venture capital. As I've gotten older, I've also given more time and passion for the sort of nonprofit investing side, foundation work through a family foundation. I've been on the Humana Foundation board for 30 some odd years. Also, I joined that when I joined the company board. And across that time have worked with a lot of interesting leaders in both for-profit, nonprofit, or as I sometimes say, tax-paying and non-tax-paying parts of the economy. And also, in the civic sector. I lost my mind in 2012 and ran for election to the Louisville Public School Board. It's about the 25th largest public system in the country, about 100,000 students, so a big urban system with all the challenges that entails. I served one term on that, chaired that board for a little while, and so that was very interesting. Running for election it is a fascinating privilege and honor and incredible pain and burden all wrapped into one bundle. Um, but so anyway, this whole governance nerd stuff, I'm really thrilled to be on your podcast because I like it in many different forms and put a lot of time into it. Is there anything that I missed from your perspective that you'd like me to flag before we jump more substantively into things?
No, you did a very nice job and you painted a perfect picture for the next question. So you have worked in all the sectors, government sector, you just talked about that. You've worked in the nonprofit sector and you continue to do so, and the for-profit sector. Just as at a 30,000 foot level, how do you compare and contrast those different sectors?
Well, thank you. It's a very broad question, and actually, as I was thinking about it, you gave me I had the benefit of knowing your questions ahead of time. I didn't actually think about the government, so I'll try to pull that into. But the venture capital work, I'll start there. Venture capital work and the foundation work, that is the grant making part of nonprofits that I do, are similar. The operating, I mean, I can also talk about the beneficiary companies, if you will, of venture investment or foundation donor. I can talk a little bit about that. But the similarity to grant making and direct investment in companies, because venture firms don't buy shares from other people like you do if you buy a public company stock. They invest directly into the company for the purpose of building a product or hiring people to go do stuff. It goes onto the company's balance sheet. Just like when you make a grant to, pick your entity, it can be to cancer research or to a food bank. The money goes to the entity to do stuff, hire people, drive trucks, accumulate inventory. It goes directly to that. So those are very different from the more passive secondary investing. And I think in each sector, my experience has been that my best results, kind of as the capital allocator, whether it's the donor or the investor, they come from two things. One is extreme clarity about what we are trying to accomplish. And that clarity, another way to say it would be alignment between the providers of the resources and the people who are going to lead the putting them to work. But you know, muddled thinking and sort of generalities are kind of the enemy in each case. I want to make healthcare cheaper could be a theme in either sector, but without more, it's a worthy moral statement, but it's not an operating guide, and you don't know how to budget around that necessarily. Um, so the other thing, and this is a little bit of a kind of a mantra in my particularly philanthropy, but it applies just as much in the other sectors. Um, I try to find people who have a unity of both passion and competence. I want people who really, really care about what they're trying to do and are just over the moon about the importance of doing it. And, there are people who are excited about all manner of things, but they have to also have the competence to get it done. And that's a really tricky question because it's not the same as expertise. It's not the same as policy knowledge. It's not the same, and one of my challenges as whether it's as a leader or investor or donor is I kind of over-index to qualities that, I mean, I like people who communicate really well to me. I mean, and that's like the biggest trap for me, because it's not about communicating. To me, if you're going to accomplish something big, you got to be able to communicate to the people you have to lead, the people you have to sell to, the people you have to um, partner with, all that stuff. Sorry, I'm going on a little bit of a too long a tangent on that, but so those are big similarities. I think the differences are, and I'm going to try to talk a little bit about government, and this is where I'm going to talk in generalities, and these are not really reliable, but in the for-profit sector, or if I could make that more specific, where you have shareholders, um, the big advantage to having shareholders is that there is relentless pressure to improve all the time. I mean, if you have a great year, um, if I mean you have a record year, and then you say, but gosh, we now have a new competitor and we're looking ahead to a really bad year. Well, your stock price goes down even faster than it went up. And that structure of the value being created or being guessed at if you're in the private markets, um, by looking forward and looking for improvement, the pace of growth, all of those metrics are just relentless. And they, and it happens all the time in the young companies. You try something, it doesn't work. Well, before you run out of money, you better stop and try something different, or your career in that enterprise is going to be really short. And in the nonprofit sector, and there's so many different, I mean, those terms, both for profit and nonprofit, are so broad, but in either the endowed, whether it's a university or a foundation world, or in the fee-for-service landscape, of take hospitals, for example, although they're not the only one, where they're financed by Wall Street, selling bonds rather than selling equities. But, in those areas, there is a real risk that as long as you um, in the hospitals, achieve your bond covenants, you pay your debt service, and you do that, then that's an okay year. That's the definition of are you doing all right from a financial perspective. And in the universities and the grant making foundations, there's crept in this idea that, giving the money away, giving a certain amount, giving a budgeted amount of it away, that as long as you do that, you have achieved your goal. And it's grossly unfair to attribute all of those features to the capital or the tax structure. But there is an absence of a pressure that the for-profit entities face. And it can be a failing for the for-profit sector also. I mean, there are times of enormous risk when organizations are making a lot of money, and they might be eating their seed corn. They may, they if they don't keep their eye on what their actual mission is to customers and to the shareholders who, I mean, this is capital markets theory. There are many different theories, but mine is the task of the board member in that kind of organization is to achieve the highest sustainable return on the shareholders' equity. But that doesn't mean, get it all right now. And often if you get it all right now and fail to take the risk of trying new things, they always take that risk of you're gonna lose, you're gonna be wrong, you're not gonna get it exactly right. Um, that pressure has to be acted on, in my view, in the for-profit sector. And in the nonprofit sector, we talked a little bit about this before, I am often frustrated by the sort of tyranny of the 5% rule, give away 5% every year, and sustainability of the endowment or the foundation is the true underlying goal. Whereas if we look at universities, at, all of healthcare, these places where the cost of the service has gotten out of range for the vast majority of the population, that is a failure of innovation in my view. And part of the problem is, you know, when you have big societal change or big technology change, just starting from the notion that we're going to invest the same every year, whether it's I mean, if we'd had that perspective going into World War II, we're just going to keep the federal budget the same. I don't know whether we'd be speaking Japanese or German right now, but it would be a different world. So,
Well, great summary and articulation between the two. And I'm curious, and leading to my next question. So, from a governance perspective, and you've governed in all sectors and focusing on the for profit sector and the nonprofit sector, what is unique? What is different in governing in those two sectors?
um, I think the similarities are bigger than the differences. I think the biggest difference is that, who elects you, the shareholders. Ultimately, you report to the shareholders, they can boot you out in the for-profit sector. And in the nonprofit sector, it's the attorney general, the state attorney general, who legally, at the time of whatever gift created the entity, the obligation to apply by so that's the kind of technical difference. But the important similarities are, first of all, respecting the difference between governance and management, or operational leadership is, I mean, it's just really, really important. I've seen just too many occasions where sort of a committee, um, the board, a group takes away the authority of the leadership structure, and they can do that by trying to help, or by being too polite when there are failures, or they can do it by meddling. But I am a big believer that the full-time people, the people who are, again, if you've chosen the convergence of passion and competence, they're going to be better at day-to-day operations, and also faster at understanding, at seeing change. Now, there's enormous similarity also in the importance of the objectivity of the board to be a counselor, or sometimes a cold voice of reality to the leadership. I mean, if there is mission drift in a nonprofit, or a for-profit, if whatever it is that you all agreed you were going to do is not working, then it's, I mean, there are all different manner of circumstances, but sometimes the people who are a little further removed are the ones who are willing to call the ball first on that. Sometimes if you have a leader with very, very praiseworthy tenacity, never give upism. I mean, the real trick of, the the great CEOs, they never, ever, ever, ever give up. And yet, when they realize they're in a hole, they stop digging and immediately pivot and do something different. So it's like those things are completely contradictory, but they're not things that groups of people can easily reach consensus on or quickly. So let me back up. So the similarities are, I mean, one of them is that difference between, the role of the full-time leadership and the board. Um, Another similarity is, I think of it as the duty of the board member to inform themselves about um, the, everything from the structure of the sector that you're working with down to the actual, what is the company doing? And there's you got to be careful in understanding the details of what the company is doing, that you don't cross that line into meddling. You don't have to be a product expert or anything like that. But, in some of the things, I mean, I'll take housing right now. Housing is an area where I have tried to study, to learn more about housing, so that philanthropically and from an impact investing perspective, that might be an area to allocate capital to, because we have a shortage of affordable housing in many cities. We have extreme problems of homelessness, which is there are different reasons why people lack housing. But, you know, before allocating capital into that, before allocating, my time or wasting a seat on a board, if I don't know anything about that, I'm not going to be very helpful as a board member. At least not in any, if, I mean, if somehow somebody thinks my name is useful, even if I'm a complete ignoramus about the topic, I'm, I'm skeptical about that. And so, we've put a lot of time over the last year and a half into trying to understand that. And my takeaway so far is housing is just as complicated as healthcare or education. There are so many different, regulatory structures, funding programs, private sector participation, guarantees that lurk in the background. And I'm not there yet. I mean, I don't feel, um, I see the problem. I wish I could be helpful, but I don't see how I can be useful, certainly as a board member, without a better context for what are the things that I'm seeing relate to. I hope that's a good example. And I think it's really important for board members to have enough knowledge that when the CEO, when the executive director comes to them with a conundrum, hey, we've really been working very closely with the food bank, and all these good things have happened, but now we're seeing this dramatic rise in street homelessness. And what should we be doing about that? I mean, want to I want to be able to somehow, not have to drag them back to ABC. Does that make
Sure.
sense?
It does make sense.
Yeah, and I'm
And
still
so,
I'm still struggling with that because, there's conflict between that and micromanaging potentially,
yes.
and also between, retaining the objectivity. Because if I buy in really heavily to my own personal hobby horse theory about causation, well, I may get out of my own lane there.
It, and
Yeah,
it's a challenge, and you're describing board work
yeah.
very eloquently. So then, what are some of the differences between for-profit, tax-paying, and non-tax-paying or nonprofit board governance? Is there a difference?
Um, you know, I think the biggest differences, between, the really good boards I've been on, or the great chief executives who I've worked with, who have led and managed their boards really well. Um, the differences are not that great, in each case. I mean, it would be very typical here for me, or my first reaction to this was, well, there's a there's a way to keep score in the for-profit corporation side. But I don't actually think that's entirely true. I mean, there is a way to keep score. Um, you have an earnings target. Did you hit it? But um, that of itself doesn't answer the question of, are you attaining that maximum sustainable earning stream? That requires judgment about risk taking for investing today for something that won't yield a return tomorrow. Similarly, in the nonprofit sector, it's very common to get a lot of anecdotal data, or maybe you know how many people went through the program, but not have long-term curative proof. And it depends on exactly what part you're looking in. I mean, if you fund research, there are different ways of looking at than if you're funding frontline human services, and but I think in each case, you have to dig a little deeper in the metrics. And the simple answer of one is easier because, I mean, if you're on a big company, public company board, and you're going to be there for 5 years or six or whatever, um, and then age out, well, okay, if you hit your business plan across that time, that's an easy way to measure success. But I mean, if you're a big software company today and you were blindsided by AI, all of a sudden a lot of people are saying, what was the board doing? Um, and I think that's both fair and unfair at the same time, because in each of the sectors there is real risk. And I didn't ever get to the government. Um, and government doesn't usually have boards. I mean, school board is a little bit of an anomaly. It acts more like a legislature in some ways, and also sadly more like an operating committee. The meddlesomeness under state regulatory requirements is big. But you know, the um, the conundrum in government leadership is that you must comply with the law, but you also have to anticipate and respond to real-time problems or opportunities. And the design of the legislature is to be more methodical and slow, and that tension is real. I think that tension is also I don't know. I mean, it's been true in a number of the nonprofits that I have worked with, both on the board and otherwise, that compliance um, can become like a proof of effectiveness, and that's usually not the case. I'm on the board of Save the Children USA, which is a fabulous and really, really well led organization. I've only been on there for 2 years, so I'm still very much in the learning of the context and everything. But a year ago, when federal support for USAID ended, that organization had to they lost 40% of their revenue and had to lay off a little more than 40% of their workforce around the world. And it was a real is very, very, very difficult. But it was not, in the realm of what happens to organizations. It was suddenly kind of a turnaround and rethinking period. Not the end of the organization. They still had 60% of their revenue and a long, history of dealing with disasters of all kinds for more than 100 years. So, or for about 100 years. And one of the things that has been interesting is that, and it's true in England, it's true in the Nordic countries, it's true in many developed countries that have been funders of international assistance, the government support pulled back. It's not just an American thing, it pulled back in a lot of places. But one of the things that has happened is the compliance demands of having government funding suddenly are absent. And there are really interesting questions about, how how might we invest better in things like in measuring not what is regulatory requirement and that we don't have any influence over, but what are we actually trying to accomplish? How do we, because fraud is a huge problem that we have to manage, that organization has to manage, all organizations have to manage. But just as an example, are there better ways? In the aftermath of flood or hurricane or civil war or something, with all these new financial technologies, might it be better to distribute cash directly to individuals rather than have kind of armies of intermediaries making double checking and making sure and those are I'm just given the all that is still in flight. How do you perform different, but there is um, innovation and creativity available in rethinking the the way you do compliance to achieve the goal that you're actually aiming at. And the goals are, I mean, the goals are really similar. You've got to make sure that you're spending the money on what it was, put under your trust for, that it's not getting stolen, that you're not drift. I mean, but the refocusing has been fascinating in that context, and it's much more. Now I'm going to reveal myself as just hopelessly nerdy, but it's much more exciting. The spirit of like, wow, look at these things that we can do and we can support is pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting. So it sounds like very similar governance when it's all
Yeah,
said and done. You've been a
yeah.
board chair on a publicly traded company. You've been a board chair, and you currently are in nonprofits. And you always a sense of that leadership role, it seems. How do you approach governing a board from a public board versus a nonprofit board? Is your approach different with each?
Um, I I think um, and I realize I'm working with, sort of the benefit of hindsight. Let me start with the public company um, expectation, and it's the expectation in a way of both. I mean, so a corporation has perpetual life. What's the legal difference between a human being and a corporation? The design of the corporation is that it can carry on as different human beings come and go. And I would say in my public company experience, the board succession and refreshment elements were more operationalized. I mean, it was, and there were kind of two reasons for that. One is just in the time of, kind of in the post Sarbanes-Oxley. You remember that reform, going back 25 years or whatever. I mean, there was a lot of focus on, kind of board inattention to risk taking with balance sheets. And one of the reform pressures that came from shareholders was let's not have boards with tenure that is too long. And so that led to, a fair amount of rethinking and also the fast technology change. And again, it depends on what sector you're in. But the need for refreshment with people who had been exposed to a fresher environment, if you will. So I think that just much more methodology. I mean, the nominating and governance committees in the public companies were more active, although I think that also probably reflects that most of my nonprofit experience has been more focused on either local or I mean, I've been very focused on kind of where I live, the region and the city where I have, kind of more local knowledge and but and also I don't know. I mean, some of the I think that whole thing is coming. I mean, like the Save the Children board, the university boards. I mean, university boards are also, I think, getting much more thoughtful about how do they bring in, contemporary knowledge, especially of tech. But I guess maybe what I would say, Michael, is that's a best practice in my experience. And I've the times I've seen it have been they've tended to be public company, um, but you could also correlate it with size. And that so yeah, good. And it's a good question. I need to think more about that.
Well, and it's interesting because we have this perspective that for-profit boards run smoothly, everybody's firing
Yeah,
on all cylinders because it's business and
yeah,
people are getting compensated. The nonprofit boards are a little less. I'll
yeah,
just leave it at that. But I'm not, but as I ask questions and just try to discern the differences, the functions are eerily similar. It's
yeah,
governance,
yeah. It's
right?
governance. Yeah.
And it's probably as effective as the board chair and the board members are.
Hmm.
And so there are a lot more similarities than differences between the two roles.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's my overall experience.
Very
Yeah,
interesting. Okay.
yeah,
You made a statement earlier, a public company, and I love this. When you and I spoke a week ago, the highest sustainable return on capital. That's the obligation of a for-profit company, the highest sustainable return on capital. Love that. Crystal clear. What's the role or obligation of a nonprofit organization? Do you have a term or a statement maybe similar?
Well, I think there's a legal answer, and then there's a I, I think it's a little hazier in the nonprofit side.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, it's useful to break it down into operating organizations and grant making organizations. But on the non-tax paying side, I already mentioned it. In return for the 501(c)(3) grants, I mean the tax status, you have to agree to stick to the mission, which is typically defined very broadly these days. The lawyers all have the same, very broad
Yes.
mission. But you also take on a set of duties. Non-inurement is really important in the grant making sector. I mean, there is vastly less transparency, particularly in the operating organization side, the 1099s for, grant making organizations. And I mean, there is some transparency, but compared to what the securities law require of publicly traded companies, it's a lot less. But all of those technical things are, I think for the nonprofit side, they really, to me, they kind of push attention to, what is our, mission, and, what is our strategy for achieving it, and making sure that you really interrogate that um, on a, not every day, but
Sure.
you gotta decide, and then you gotta go pursue, and then you have to review, are you being effective, and things like that. And I think, again, there's a high level similarity. You got to make sure that you're taking enough, you're investing, you're taking enough risk on finding the new, and that you're being honest about what you're not, I mean, not honest in the sense of not cheating, but honest in your evaluation and your appraisal of, of what are we doing. So, um, I think, the biggest conundrum for me right now, and it's partly a, kind of a human existential, thing. I'm 68 years old. It's becoming obvious I can't take it with me. What happens to, my stuff, money, all of these things. And, but I think the lack of that kind of um, pressure on endowed foundations or operating entities, um, there are real benefits to it, right? I mean, you can be very steady in your approach, And if you can be very steady behind something really important, and some of the, drug discovery support, for example,
Mm.
there, and the whole scientific medicine as it exists today, a lot of that was funded by really long-term support. I think going back in the day, like University of Chicago, and was it Rockefeller that that funded not just individual super important discoveries, but the whole frame. So there are definitely reasons for this idea of perpetuity, or at least long-termism. But we have we just have an awful lot of entities and an awful lot of money socked away in either 5% a year, including overhead costs, or in the case of DAFs, often zero. Just you know take take I mean, you remove it from transparency and
Yeah.
taxation, contributing alongside all the operating businesses and people and everything. So I think that is that's the biggest difference. And I find there is definitely both academic and strategic thought being
Mm.
given to this, to this question. But it's really, really hard, hard to change the, in an environment where, there's no inurement. People generally have, they're not financially dependent on the outcome of what's going on. There is reputational um, risk, but that is highly focused on don't do anything wrong,
Yeah.
don't have a scandal. Whereas, what are we going to do about, education? Both the current price structure and the, different equity, um, issues across, not just higher ed, but all aspects. And then also I mean, what we used to call digital opportunity, now AI opportunity. I mean, these are not like, well, you know, we have $5 billion, on our balance sheet as Foundation X, um, but we can only afford to give $15 million to that aspect of our strategy this year. I mean, it just seems like there is, to me, a real mismatch between the the notion that this capital is there to do good, and the fact that, you know, kind of good and bad in human history are, either unpredictable or often cyclical. And, they demand different times, demand different responses. That was a totally long ramble, and I think I probably got way away from your question. Did I answer you?
Well, you did, and then some, which is important because it was leading to the next question. And you touched on this. Are there, if you were king for a day, are there any structural changes, or what changes would you make to philanthropy so that it really can make systemic change? You said there's a misalignment, and I love how you articulated that because I think those of us in the industry, we share that.
Yeah.
What would have to change?
Um, I think, um, staying only at the structural level, I think I would, um, you know, maybe both, certainly one or the other, either increase the distribution
Mm,
requirement, effect so that it is effectively a spend down requirement, or a push toward more actively and aggressively investing.
mm,
Because, I mean, it is possible that these balance sheets themselves could be useful, although probably, I mean, probably not. It's too small in comparison to the broad capital markets. It's not enough capital to really matter outside of the support um, side. Um, but or limit the lifespan of the non-taxpaying corporations. But put pressure on the governance to define what matters, and this is, I think the things, if I had time, I'd love to kind of study the Gates Foundation and the Buffett, the initiative of putting in and then, pulling back to some extent, the idea of, if I understood that right, Warren Buffett um, said this is the most innovative, aligned, um,
Mm.
investor for the common good who I can find at this time in my life. So I mean, and that's kind of the way he, his investment philosophy was find people who know what they're doing and, and support them. And I do think the focus and taking on of really been big projects has been exciting, and enabled by that kind of, you know, creating freedom from the ordinary rule of just leave it, to the next generation of fiduciaries, however you find them. But I'm not, I haven't studied that enough to really
Mhm.
understand. My guess is, I mean, if you backed further away, you'd say, hey, there are lots of examples of, you know, big piles of capital that are wasted. There are lots of examples of big piles of capital that are lucky.
Sure.
And then there are other ones of, where they really, really, really do, great things, with it. And I just, in my dream world, the structure would increase the possibility of doing really, really good things.
Mm.
Because,
Yeah.
I mean, if you're on a foundation board, I mean, there's no barrier to you saying, hey, like, I don't know what it is, but like, gosh, X cancer is, the combination of CRISPR and, machine learning could, for X amount of money, we could create, instead of 20 at bats per decade in going after this cancer, we could create 500 a
Yeah.
month or 10,000 a month or whatever. I mean, those kinds of opportunities are, or eradicating malaria. I mean, back to Gates. I mean, there are
Exactly.
just
Yeah.
things that, so anyway, that's where I would take it.
Mhm.
Um, but
Much to think about and to continue conversation at some point. But I do want to end on this question because
yeah.
you're, and I alluded to this earlier. You're clearly a leader. You ascend to the ultimate leadership roles in any organization. Do you have a leadership philosophy or an
Um,
approach?
I think so I definitely have, I have a philosophy, and I have an approach. Kind of focus and clarity are at the heart of it. Um, Essential is, um, whatever the personality traits are or the habits that you have formed that allow followership, because you can't be a leader without followers. And that's where, I mean, like, kind of know where you're going and have the communication and inspiration skill set to get people to follow you. But I am completely unable. I can enunciate what I'm looking for, in that latter point, but leaders come in so many different
Yeah.
shapes and sizes and ages and backgrounds. I mean, there just are, and they often, arise from, you know, failure, from bad experiences, right? I mean, Ulysses Grant was not, um, he didn't win the Civil War because he had an unblemished track record when he first was put in charge. And, so those, you know, I mean, those are the things that I think it's really important to both try to, um, live by, but also see in other people. One other thing, and this is, it's not a hard and fast rule, but actually there are a couple of, I'll give you two: governance. things that I try to keep in my mind, don't always act on. But the first thing is it's largely a venture capital derived rule, but I think it applies elsewhere. If I go to two board meetings in a row and things are not working, right? Things are whatever it's clear that things are not going as we
Hmm.
intend. And B, I do not understand, then the answer is fire the CEO. And that a perfectly acceptable answer from the CEO is things are not going as planned. We think it's this. Here's what we're doing. And the second meeting, we were wrong. Things are still not
Sure.
working. We tried X and that didn't work. So now we're going to try Y. But if I am confused, my typical reaction for a long time has been if I'm confused, it's because I didn't do enough to
Mm.
understand. And that's the wrong if the CEO is kind of at sea, then a change is probably in order. And the new twist, and this reflects my age, I think, as much as anything, but also just what I'm seeing in the world. If things are in a muddle, and this is really, I've seen some great nonprofit examples of this, in the kind of coming out of COVID, actually, is that, like when so much chaos and so much,
Mm.
just such a big mess. But that's getting, that excuse is getting old. And or that explanation is getting old. And a thing that I've seen work really well in a number of occasions is the, you know, if the organization is lost, skip a generation and bring in a new CEO. I mean, bring in somebody who is much younger.
Ah,
You get the enthusiasm of, someone in a kind of a stretch job. If and you often have people who are have chosen to be doing whatever they're doing because of great passion for the cause. And you also have, often, I mean, younger people who have taken advantage of, the digital education opportunities, the kind of travel and global exploration in what has been, despite the, the kind of climate of pressure and fear we live in, an incredible peaceful period in world history.
yeah.
I mean, there are just fantastic people who are unburdened by the failure but have seen it, and are just ready, set, go on, you know let's let's make it, and they're just not bound to anything, the way it was. So those are cliches, but we all have to have little questions we ask ourselves when, to make ourselves think about, shaking up, whatever is not working. And those are my two favorites right now. Anyway, that's not a leadership philosopher. That's a change leadership philosophy. But I mean, passion and competence, and communication ability that gets you, that enables people to follow you, whatever that might look like.
Well, I welcome that summation and the optimism and hope in the younger generation. We always got to like to hear that, and that's how I'll interpret your statement. David Jones, the,
Absolutely.
the board chair of Humana Foundation, among many other things. David, thank you so much for coming on today and sharing a little bit about governance and your philosophies on things. This was a very educational and welcoming discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. It was really fun to talk to you. I appreciate your good questions, and take care.
All right, recapping with Reed. Boy, David had a lot to say there and such good stuff. What are your three takeaways, Reed?
David tries to find people who have both a unity of passion and competence to lead the organizations that he funds or is involved with.
Yeah, it really makes a lot of sense. He articulated that very well. Number two.
It's extremely important for the board to remain objective. In terms of that, he means like they can be the counselor or that voice of reality for leadership. And sometimes they are the ones that can actually call out that mission creep because they are not in the organization every single day. They can see it from a higher point of view than the leadership can.
And wasn't that interesting? So that's obviously a problem even on the for-profit side where people will get into the business beyond governance. I just thought that was really interesting. And number three,
I thought it was interesting. He talked about the compliance demands of receiving government funding and then putting a spin on. We've heard so much of the negative aspects of losing your government funding, but putting the positive spin on it that you lose those compliance regulations as well. So maybe you can do more with less without having to comply with those extreme levels of, without having to comply with all of those regulations.
yeah, that's interesting. I didn't think about it that way, but that was an interesting interpretation. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, recapping with Reed, his three takeaways from our conversation with David Jones. And we will I-501 see you next time.